Oh, no. I'd rather everyone introduce themselves. Just quick, who you are, who you represent.
Yeah. Hello.
Go for it, Gavin. Yeah, go for it.
Hello.
Left to right.
That's okay. Hello, I'm Gavin Bridge. I'm a property developer. My business is Cubex, and we're based in Bristol.
Cara?
Hi, I'm Cara. I'm an architect here in Bristol, but I also represent Art Space, Life Space, and Land is Life.
Shanks.
I'm Shanks. I'm an architect based in Bristol. I have a company called Nudge Group. I'm on the board of the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects in London, and I teach at Newcastle and at Cardiff University in architecture and design.
Hi, I'm Lotta Daly. We're sitting on the non-architect side of the table here. So I am the Assistant Director of Operations actually at the National Trust at the moment, but my previous roles have been in the cultural sector, so here in Bristol for Spike Island and Turner Contemporary in Margate, which are things I reflect on probably today.
Hello, I'm Henry, and I wrote a book all about gentrification of Bristol called Voices of Bristol, Gentrification and Us. Hence, me being here for, this is entitled Regeneration Without Displacement, so that's the link there.
Can everyone hear everyone? Is it all good?
You feel free to take the mics closer.
Okay.
Hear me without a mic? Yeah, so, just make sure everyone speaks clearly into mics. Okay, so title of this conversation, we're going to start, and we'll get to make sure we've got lots of time for questions at the end as well. So, regeneration without displacement. I want to just open the floor to Henry, first of all, with your book title, because obviously it's quite interesting. Gentrification, regeneration, what's the difference? What are we doing wrong, Henry?
Generally, what's being done with new developments historically and to this day is with any new residential development in particular, not enough affordable houses are being built. That's because there's not the central government policy control in place to make that happen. When you say what we're doing wrong, you mean in terms of...
Well, like regeneration should be good for everyone, our area gets better. What are we getting wrong?
This is another thing, actually, is developers often speak of regeneration in a way which is synonymous with gentrification. That is, with any new development, they'll speak about regeneration in this positive normative sense, when actually people in these lower socioeconomic groups will, especially in the inner city areas, won't be able to afford these new properties. I have a friend called Jesse, who is born and bred Bedminster, a very proud Bedminster person. There's a new development there called the St. Catherine's development. Can he afford the market rates, rents around there of £850, £950, whilst working at the BRI on minimum wage? No. Could he even afford the affordable rent, so-called, at 80%, reclassified in 2011? I think Boris Johnson was responsible partly for that reclassification as well. No, we can't afford those either. So a revision in central government policy in that respect is one thing that's needed.
Okay. So if regeneration, we're getting it wrong, how do we get it right? Cara, I just want to hear a little bit more about your trust and Land is Life and your work with Indigenous communities and the idea about working with existing groups. Just give us some examples of where you think we can get it a bit better.
I think generally it's about engaging the communities at a very early stage. So it's a kind of very multiple-stranded issue here. One of the reasons why we're so unsuccessful in terms of our development in the cities is because of the disconnect from nature, and what happens to us as human beings is we tend to start treating the land as a commodity and not as a living organism. And what we can learn from the indigenous people is that there's this inherent connection that's much deeper than just putting concrete into the ground.
That's really interesting because there was, I don't know if anyone's seen the National Design Guide, the updated version, but there's the 10 new characteristics, and it's all about context is like the primary characteristic. They're sort of talking exactly about that, about nature and culture and, existing heritage structures and things like that. So, Gavin, I know you've got some examples and you're doing a piece of work with the Land Trust as well. Is it something you can give us a bit more of an insight on in terms of how you practically engage communities in those conversations at that early stage?
Well, I don't think the development community does, generally speaking, engage properly. I'm sure that lots of people have seen documents which say Vision 4, and there's almost sort of square brackets around it, insert name of town here, really. One of the things I'm passionate about, and we haven't got it right yet, I admit that, is better public engagement and consultation with communities in which we are developing, particularly around younger people. I think Henry spoke very eloquently there about the problems and the challenges of finding somewhere to live, which is a basic need. But often we find with engagement with our communities is that trying to engage with younger people, and it is a challenge because you tend to find, and I think about my words carefully here, but you tend to find that the people that are more active in objecting or perhaps supporting development tend to be older, I would say, and maybe have got more time, maybe retired, maybe feel more connected with society, whereas younger people may not be not feel they're connected with society, but also they're very busy. And I think there's got to be a way of using technology more in the way that we do our public consultation, which I think is more appropriate for people today, rather than simply putting letters through doors saying, turn up next Tuesday and have a chat about what we're doing.
Shanks, I know you've done quite a lot of community consultation. You've led a lot of, processes. You're also an architect yourself. You sit on a lot of different boards. Have you got any practical examples of that type of connecting, reaching out to different groups who might not usually participate, younger people?
In terms of, I suppose, community engagement, it has its merits and it is very useful. There's lots of ways to do it through food and music and sort of those sorts of like street parties and street events, like when we did Love Eastern, sort of Ruth's over there, sort of back in 2009. But I think the bigger issue that we have here is the price of land and the issues. So, for example, I got some stats out. We've got rents in Bristol have gone up 33% in 4 years. We've got a situation where it's 250. So say if a one-bed flat is £930, it's £250 more in Bristol than the average in England. Who's sort of slightly had enough of capitalism now? Who in the audience has had enough? Yeah, okay. I mean, if we look at it, the global picture, the global situation that we're in is that people are moving from rural to urban, from countryside to cities. And why is that happening? A big part of it is capitalism and our need for growth and finances and everyone, having to pay direct debits to big multinational companies. So if you actually look at where your direct debits are going every month, that's where they're going. They're going to really big corporations and organisations. That feeds straight back into how we're living locally in Bristol day to day because people creatives, like one of the most amazing things about Art Space, Live Space is what they've been doing in the last 10 years and being able to activate this building and the work that they did in the centre of town over 10 years ago. But it's hard to keep hold of. It ends up being given to larger investors. But they need to make their profit margins, the cost of buying that property. All of these things add up to making it very difficult for people to afford to live in the city. So what do we do about it? We've got to take ownership as communities of these buildings so that the rents can stay cheap for creatives, artists, and for people to rent.
So what do we do about that then, panel? Apart from down with capitalism, practically, what are we going to do? Cara.
To build on what Martin was suggesting
Yeah.
earlier better with this one, is the community land trust and land contributions. Because quite a lot of the land is either privately owned or privately rented. A lot of that finance, as Shanks was saying, a lot of the profit is siphoned out of the city and does not go back into the local economy. Now, we have things in policy that's called Section 106 and community levy.
Infrastructure levy,
Infrastructure levy. Sorry, I'm an architect, by the way.
SIL, just say SIL.
SIL. And for those in the audience that don't know what these funds are, they're basically one-off payments by clients, or correct me if I'm wrong, that will contribute to some kind of public art or something for the public. but it's not sustainable. And if we looked at that model and said, okay, maybe these landlords or landowners could look at a more sustainable long-term contribution for the local economy, then that will help raise the funds that artists need to then afford the rent.
Yeah, I think from our own experience, we've found that the tracking of where community infrastructure levies money is spent is quite hard to follow sometimes. And sometimes there's been situations where there's a time limit on when the local authority needs to spend that money, and it doesn't get spent. So the planning applicant can go and claim that money back. And I think there's also an issue, as with a room full of artists today, where art is put lower down in the pecking order as well. So I think it's really to champion councillors and planning departments to try and wrestle some of that money away. But I think the point you're making about sustainability is really important, because sometimes a bit of cynicism where it goes down to public art, and then there's an organisation employed to go out and speak to 6 artists to create a sculpture or statue. Yes, that is art, but maybe there's a better way of investing it into bringing empty buildings back to life and investing in a longer term and then growing a business like that. I think we're very supportive of that.
I'm well for that as well.
Yeah.
I just want to bring Lothar in because you haven't spoken yet. And we had a really interesting journey together, you and I, about Jacobs Wells Baths.
We keep trying to get hold of buildings and do interesting things with them, and we never manage to
quite nail it.
Quite nail it.
What do you think, and what are your thoughts in terms of that, the practicality around that actually driving the change and obtaining a building where there's a lot of kind of obstacles in the way?
Well, I think Emma and I have kind of explored this a lot, and as have Catherine and Art Space, Life Space too. And I think that we've faced a number of difficulties. One has been the kind of the knowledge of the council in terms of what they actually want that building to do and how they, what do they see it as serving the community, and that can be, in a number of different ways. And then also their need to make revenue from it and make money from it and things like that. And also wanting a level of security in terms of what they think the building is going to get turned into. So our example with Jacobs Wells Baths, which was something that we bid for as a collective to turn into a fuller art space. So it already has a dance sprung floor in it, and we were going to turn it back into a public venue to be used for the arts. But the company that was actually awarded the contract, Fusion Leisure, had a lot more money behind it. It had a lot more backing, and on paper, it looked like the best option, to kind of move forward with. Unfortunately, my understanding is that hasn't happened. I don't believe anything's moved forward to date.
It's all gone a bit quiet.
Sorry, it's all gone a bit quiet. Okay. And also, it's sometimes quite difficult to have that fuller engagement, like you're kind of talking about, with what does it really mean to engage the community, and who is the community, and who is that community serving? So something we came up against within that was that there was already quite a small group of people using that building, and that's great. They were looking after it and bringing it to life, but it wasn't being used more broadly, and in their eyes, turning it into a swimming pool and working with a corporate, again, seemed like a better service for the community, whereas kind of going with the more risky arts, led regeneration project didn't fill them with a lot of confidence. So it was quite difficult for us to kind of win both parties over in that instance, and combined, that resulted in a no to the arts project in this.
Maybe isn't that part of the challenge, though, is that sometimes the arts is seen as part of the problem rather than the solution? Like Henry, I guess, especially with some of the things around Hamilton House and, that kind of perception that the area has become gentrified and the artist is the kind of catalyst for that rather than kind of the victim of their own success. What do you think?
Yeah, it seems a lot of emphasis seems to be put on the arts as a sort of therapeutic, cathartic solution to mental ailments or some sort of just to make life better for people who are in need. But art seems to be not so much a necessity as housing. Art, creating breeding grounds which are beautiful artistically seems to be a bandage on a broken bone, in that people perhaps being mentally unwell, because by the way, you're more likely to be mentally unwell if you can't afford housing, a necessity. for all humans, it seems to be something of secondary concern, as far as I'm concerned. As far as the question of how do you, and this has happened in Stokes Croft, right? We were speaking earlier about a lack of reconciliation between Stokes Croft and St. Paul's. There seems to be a sort of divide there in the culture that I've never seen bridged properly. You get every now and then some sort of collaborative efforts. Lawrence Hu, the poet from St. Paul's, is an example of that, of engaging, and vice versa. But yeah, with the question of regeneration without displacement, the only way I can see that actually viably happening is through central government policy change and introduction of different laws. Things like a revision to something called the viability assessment, which you'll know about. They did revise it through pressure from MPs like Kerry McCarthy in East Bristol. Viability assessment, if you don't know, is what the developer can point to excuse themselves from building the local authorities' expected levels of percentage of affordable housing. So that was reworded earlier this year, but it wasn't strong enough, you see, because the rewording was this: developers can no longer expect a competitive profit on any development, but a reasonable. And so there's a lot of ambiguity there. You need something a lot more concrete.
Love a bit of ambiguity, don't we?
No,
in
I
our
do.
policies.
Well,
and-
you do if you're rich.
yeah, exactly. It's a
and-
good way to wiggle out of what you have to do.
Yeah. Other central government policy changes like repealing the right to buy, which lots of you know about, the right to buy council houses from 1980. In 1980, about 33% of housing in Bristol was council-owned. It's now 13%. And if national figures or anything to go off, about 45% of those, 40 to 45% of those will belong to buy-to-let landlords. So you speak about sustainability, that's not a sustainable model.
So, there's a lot of weight and emphasis there as well placed on kind of developments and kind of private companies, kind of just they're out there to get their money and get their ways around, find the little loopholes to make as much money as possible. What is the responsibility there on developers, on architects, kind of producing these designs? Guys, have you got any thoughts about that kind of ethical responsibility of architects, and what can we really hold people to in terms of the national guidelines are there, but do we think we're going to see any change as a result of that in terms of future developments?
There's a lot of ground to cover here.
Yeah.
And I'm certainly not a speaker for the development community, and again, Henry's illustrated well some failings of that. Just if we could just pick up on the point about the development appraisals and viability assessment, I think the challenge we have is the way that they are tackled is that, unfortunately, the key, the land piece, has already been acquired. So the development appraisal is done once the land's acquired. So my argument is always, well, actually, there's too much being paid for the land in the first place, and that can't change because it's been acquired, and then all the other costs are taken into account, and then there's the development at the bottom. So we need to find a way of looking at the viability of schemes for that. However, we comply with building regulations, we comply with planning conditions. So it should just be across the board. For example, in Bristol, that on larger sites, one has to deliver 20% affordable housing. And again, to illustrate Henry's point, that's at a social rent level, not what's called a discount market rent, which is what Henry talked about being 80%, and social rents, generally speaking, about 60% of the rent. So that's really important. I think on the architect's point, I'm sorry, I don't want to be speaking for architects here, but I think we need more if we're using this term regeneration, I'm quite uncomfortable about it, is we need more diversity across the board, not only in architecture, but in planning, in development, and also the money that we use, fund management. There needs to be more diversity in that. So it's not just people like me, bit overweight, white, middle-class, straight man, making decisions about development. We need to reflect society and the investment decisions we make. So behind what we do, there's a whole body of pension funds and pension fund managers, and if you're lucky enough to have a pension, your pension fund might be invested into regeneration or development. And I think it's important to sort of lobby the people who make those decisions on behalf of your pension. If you're a teacher, you work for a local authority, to make sure that investing in ethical development, sustainable in a broader sense as well, and making sure the right levels of affordable housing are being delivered.
Guys, have you got any other thoughts on that about?
I'm sort of working on a 33,000 square foot creative space in the centre of town at the moment, and I guess diversity is key. So one of the things that I'm lobbying with my client is to say, actually, no, let's not create large units for big businesses. Let's break this up, and the ground floor is actually more hot desking, and it's flexible space, and it's much lower rents, and they're smaller units. The next floor up, smaller units, and it might get bigger, and you have larger units as you move up through the building, but you've got to allow for those startups, and you've got to allow for people who are, you know, working just on their own or self-employed, who want to get out and not be working just in their home. So trying to create those environments that allow that, and also allowing more independent businesses. So if we're going to have a cafe or a shop, make sure it's independent, so it's not big business that's moving in there. And actually, quite a few developments in London are really advocating that as well. So I have to go and look at buildings for the Architecture Journal, and a lot of people are moving that in that direction. So that's positive.
Yeah, just to add to that, so I work for a commercial architects. I'm not going to name them because my opinions are my own. But just to add to that, you know, we do have a lot of clients that just are paying for schemes that they can then sell off. And so they want the security of, say, a commercial chain to take over a ground floor space, for instance. And again, that will create less diversity in a scheme. So if we could push as designers, I don't know how we can try to tell our clients that this is important to keep things local. But I don't know, you know, in your experience, Shanks, your approach, you can choose almost who to work for, what type of clients you work for, whereas we can't, as a commercial practice, necessarily do that.
But I think the enlightened money, if we can talk about that, wants the vibrancy, wants the independence. Bristol's about independent business. It wants the vibrancy. That actually creates value in what else you're doing around it. And the people don't see that are stupid, and they're old ways of doing things. So you can compare. Let's talk about two schemes. So you can compare, say, Temple Quay, which is very vanilla and corporate and is dead, and then someone like Wapping Wharf, which is full of independent businesses. So Stuart down there has created a value in his residential development by looking at independent businesses, and I think that enlightened investors see that now and accept that they're not going to have, say, a Tesco or a Greggs or something like that on the ground floor. They're going to have independent businesses that might be at no rent or little rent, because it adds vibrancy and actually adds value, and that's where people want to go. They don't want, they don't want to be another clone town, another high street.
Can I just come in there a second?
Go for it.
Just one of the things, though, is that you've got to sort of bear in mind who are all those things actually for.
Yeah.
And, you know, Margate isn't necessarily somewhere that's had lots of property developers coming in, but the resulting regeneration of Margate has basically meant, yes, you do have lots of interesting independent shops and vintage and coffee and a whole lot of things, but they are generally, you know, for the middle class visitors, therefore the new middle class residents that have moved in. And I was back in, you know, Margate a couple of weeks ago, and it was devastating to see that all the kind of places where you would buy a pair of pants or a normal top, or, you know, just where can the normal person go about their day-to-day life, that all of that has gone. And so unless you want Danish G-plan furniture, it's, you know, it's just not a practical place anymore. And you know, obviously I was part of Turner Contemporary and the arts-led regeneration, so don't get me wrong, there were lots of wonderful things that happened. But now, for the actual people who were there in the first place, there's even less for them, and they can't just go about their daily life. So sometimes we sort of turn our noses up at the Tesco or the, you know, the Primark or whatever it might be being in the ground floor. But if it actually serves the community and means that they can actually buy the things they need to buy on a daily basis and doesn't push them out and make them use cars and, you know, all of that kind of stuff, I think there needs to be a balance in terms of
a blend.
a blend and a balance in terms of who is it for. We can't all live in Wapping Wharf every day.
Henry,
you know,
you got
it's just
any-
not feasible.
Henry, you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I agree. And I think it's especially bittersweet when the developers in question aren't meeting Bristol City Council expectations of X amount of affordable housing. It's interesting you say 20%, because 30% is the general sort of go-to figure that I understand it from different circles that I mix in, Acorn, Community Union, or speaking to Housing Cabinet Minister Paul Smith.
There's 20%
Yeah, so I would so another thing that I would dispute then would be 20%. I think 20% affordable housing. Just think about that as a word, even if it is a euphemism, and it is. All housing should be affordable. It's a silly debate, I think. I think you make a really good point when you speak about alienation in the communities and not feeling actually welcome to go to these new artistic areas. Financial displacement is one type of displacement, but another is cultural alienation, cultural displacement. I work for a housing association in St. Paul's, inner city area in Bristol, and I was speaking with a mother the other day, and she'd been locked out. And by the way, St. Paul's is up and coming. If you don't know, it's up and coming. But I was speaking with this mother, and she'd been locked out of her house, and she got two kids there, or 3 kids. And I said to her, "Why don't you? Okay, your partner's gonna come down and let you in. Why don't you go across the road to the cafe? Just somewhere to stay rather than the lobby." And she said, "Oh, I don't want to go over there. It's too expensive. They charge a fortune." So, by the way, this is a lady who grew up in St. Paul's, whose parents have been in St. Paul's for decades. So cultural displacement, if you like, is something. The street parties of Easton, the most 40 street parties, the most in all of Europe. Just because you have parties there doesn't mean that all feel welcome to go to it. I spoke to one chap who had actually moved from Perry Road in Easton because him and his mother just didn't feel welcomed.
Isn't this part of the challenge as well? Because obviously we've talked a bit about kind of obviously developers wanting to make money, and that's kind of quite a driving factor. But isn't part of it is just about a bit what Martin touched on about people wanting to fit things in boxes and actually creative spaces that serve different purposes? That kind of messy pluralism is the thing that actually complicates things. It complicates developers thinking about different types of mixed-use spaces, different communities kind of rubbing up against one another, and this kind of push for kind of multi-use cultural space as well. I just wonder if there's something around that the panel, might be able to kind of reflect on, what's the kind of fix around kind of communicating the kind of importance of that sort of vibrancy in that mixed ecology. Thoughts? Provocation?
Are you architects? Sorry, some of you, is that? So, do any work in commercial developments, residential commercial developments? So, is there any lobbying or any onus being put on your employers by some sort of architects union to fulfill their civic duty to the cities in which they build, and to make sure that basic necessity of real affordable housing is being made? Is there anything like that?
To my knowledge, it doesn't exist. The reason is a lot of architects, particularly commercial architects, are afraid to step up because we might lose our clients. And interestingly, you say that on a slightly different topic. I was at a climate action workshop. I attended 2 over the past couple of weeks, and I asked the question: what if we said no to developments? What if we were brave enough to say no to developments that either one displaced communities or displaced people culturally, displaced the nature, or ecologically damaging the land that they're on? What would it be like for us to put our foot down in that? And I think that the time is coming, that we're coming together to do that, but we need more events like this, and actually invite more of these commercially minded people to participate.
Henry, you brought up the viability question. So I was really shocked because I don't do commercial residential, but I ended up at a networking event in London and speaking to somebody who was, and this was about 10 years ago, and they'd set up a company a year before that. Basically, their company, their role was to do these viability documents and to prove that it wasn't viable to do affordable housing. So that's what ends up happening with, there was, about 6 years ago, there was 273 planning applications for high-rise in London, and none of them had the amount of affordable housing that they should have done, because there's these companies in place to do viable assessments that prove that the land costs too much, and therefore to build it costs too much. Cannot put affordable housing on there.
It's ironic as well, because these capitalists in question, they become archaeologist buffs as well in the process, don't they? They say, oh no, there's an Anglo-Saxon skeleton from 1.5 millennia ago, and we need to... and everyone knows that affordable housing is allergic to Anglo-Saxon skeletons. They did reword it to say, in my understanding, to...
Let's stick to the subject. Without displacement, little disclaimer, we can displace kind of old artifacts, maybe.
I
don't
put
know.
my national trust hat on for that, but let's not get into archaeology and what can and can't be moved. But I think we were kind of having quite an interesting discussion, as you were talking about before, and as I heard the last speaker at the end, just talking about, community land trusts, community-led housing, and there are examples now where, rather than the housing just kind of going into the normal housing market and getting quickly unaffordable, there are some schemes where the housing price is actually tied to the average salary. So there's a particular housing scheme, for example, in Leeds, I think it's called Lilac, and so it is tied to what is the average wage in Leeds, and so the house prices hopefully will remain affordable because there is that continual linkage, rather than what we currently have, which is something like, isn't it, 7 times your salary or 8 times your salary for I mean, it probably
Depends
more
on what you earn.
Bristol. It depends on what you earn. Well, exactly. It totally depends on what you earn. And I think there are some developers who are working, trying to make long-term commitments to communities, to the local area, to use local labour, to use local resources. And I think we have to kind of, as you were saying, stand up for that and encourage that and try and do more of that. But there is the problem of land ownership always behind all of this. So how we get that land ownership out of just being held for wealth, held and not being used, is a continual issue.
And I guess with Bristol City Council, there's quite a bit of disposal of public assets going on. There's something about like £30 million of public assets have been sold over the last 4 or 5 years to generate income, to backfill cuts to social care, etc., etc. So I guess what is the onus that we could place on our kind of local authority to kind of safeguard those kind of publicly owned kind of spaces, in order to kind of maybe take a bit more of a leap on some of these schemes that might provide us with a kind of an affordable answer. Have you got any thoughts?
Just talking about sort of community land trusts, I helped set up Bristol Community Land Trust about 8 years ago. It took us 3.5 to 4 years just to establish ownership of one piece of land, which we eventually got for £1, which was number 1 Fish Ponds Road in Bristol. But it took 4 years just to get to a stage of getting ownership of that piece of land for £1 to try and develop it in a way that meant that it could be affordable. So how do you get the community involved, people that need that type of housing, and make that happen? The problem with it is the risk. The council are scared to take the risk because of being sued, essentially, and also trying a different model of... So the structure of building is about 30% of the total cost of a build. 70% is fittings and finishes. So the idea being that the fittings and finishes could be done by the people that take ownership of their unit, of their house. But we couldn't even establish some sort of agreement to make that happen because of the risk associated with allowing people to self-build in that environment via a piece of land from the council for £1. Yeah. So it is really difficult. Like, people are trying really hard to do it. And I sort of was on the board for about 5 years, and I kind of just had enough. I was like, this is too slow. I don't have the patience for this. Because you're kind of like out there wanting to get as much affordable housing as possible, and it's...
Okay, so it's messy, expensive,
Yeah.
really takes a long time, and it's like a pain in the bum and tiring. Is there anything that we can do to kick some of this into action? Any thoughts before I kind of open up, because I'm conscious I'd like to get some questions from the floor. Has anyone got any questions, actually? Show of hands first so I can gauge it, then I can carry on talking or not. 1, 2, 3, that was quite a few at once. Oh, I'm interested to know what that is.
Well, I think that we've got to look at trying to bring empty council property back into use. About 15 months ago, I was told there's a figure of 100,000 square feet of property that's empty, that owned by the City Council. So there's got to be a dogged review of that and bring it back into use, even just minimal use for housing, but also for different sort of occupancy. I think we've got to look at the Section 106 and community infrastructure level monies, and trying to put those to invest in the longer term to build stronger artistic spaces. And maybe one could look at, you're talking earlier about somebody wanting to rent just a chair and a desk, is maybe sponsoring some place within buildings so that people don't have to pay any rent for 5 years whilst they build their business. So looking at that. I know you're involved in engine sheds, so maybe looking at replicate that maybe in the artistic world as well, I think. And compulsory purchase of buildings as well. I think the councils will be more brave, and I think they're looking at doing that, so compulsory purchasing buildings on behalf of local communities.
I don't want to open up a whole other area, but I think quite a lot of that square footage that you're talking about is just over there. And a lot of it is now kind of tied up in the what will happen with the Western Harbour. Yeah, the Western Harbour issue. So I think it'd be interesting to see what that kind of whole, whether that is entirely, for example, funded by overseas money, and what does it actually do, and what are you displacing to make that, if it happens. I mean,
I want to get some questions from the floor. Show me your hands. Who wants to speak? There's a guy at the back. He was really quick. What's your name? What do you want to say?
My name's Danny. I just think that there's two areas that have been sort of missed or not gone into enough in this conversation. One is sort of finance, more global finance side of it. There's a brilliant film that's released this year by Frederick Gerton called Push. I thoroughly recommend seeing it. I'm not sure it's out in the UK yet, but it will be soon. And that really takes a kind of like good look at how global finance is affecting this sort of like very question. And on the other side of it, it's community building. And what we do to kind of really build bridges and create community within these places as well. And the two sort of things come together. And that living space, I think, is where you need real strong political actors. And I think that's what we've really lacked so far in the city, or certainly ones that deliver anyway. And I just wonder whether or not the panel has any thoughts on how we can really, as the public of Bristol, make sure that we cultivate or make those kind of political actors be responsive to those parameters.
Cara?
I might touch on Danny's second point there about bringing communities together. I think there's quite a lack of these types of spaces, especially in urban environments, where people can feel comfortable enough to linger. Public parks, things like that. There are quite a lot of them around Bristol are not really well kept, and they're unsafe. Ashton Court's great, but anywhere else, I think, is there a way that we can, as designers even, reinvigorate these intermediate spaces between districts that will allow communities to feel like they can take ownership of them? Because that's where all the conversations start to happen, and that's where we all start to create these weaving these bonds. And again, that brings my point back to the lack of connection to nature, where we've become spectators to nature rather than inherently acknowledging that we're part of it. And if we are a bit more conscious about that, then it means we can look at how we view our city in a completely different way.
And there is a sort of second part to that question around kind of global kind of economics and how that impacts locally. Has anyone got any thoughts about that, and what kind of the pushback could be either locally or kind of politically? What should we be doing to try and make better communities that people want to live in and that they can afford to live in?
Well, this is where, this is where your political ideology goes one way or the other, really. I personally see collaborative living, cooperative living as secondary, as effective and beautiful, but it's secondary to this innate desire, especially in Britain, to have your own castle. George Orwell spoke about this in England, Your England, which he was trying to instill patriotism during the Second World War. People want their own home, generally. So the question is, do you borrow lots and lots of money to build lots of council housing, which is what the parties to the left are proposing, or are you more conservative in your approach? This is where the prospect of a national bank comes in, and is very interesting, because the general response from my uncle's generation, my uncle being asymmetrical to me and actually not really seeing the point in council housing, would say, well, no, because interest rates will go flying if you borrow and all the rest of it. The interesting about a national bank is that you would have the ability, as far as I understand it, to set interest rates yourself, and to lend yourself. So, yes, that's an idea.
So national bank.
And I think similar to that, probably people are already familiar here with the Preston model and what's been happening in Preston in terms of Preston Council, which is a Labour-run council, have taken a deliberate turn to localism. Their first step was paying a living wage. Their second step was favouring procurement within Preston and then within Lancashire. They're now setting up a regional cooperative bank. And they are trying to make sure that they are taking those properties as well that we're talking about, those assets that are owned by the council, and definitely, putting in the kind of schemes that you're talking about to make sure that people can live and work and, all the things that they need to do in the area without being pushed out. So I think there are models actually really starting to happen in the UK that our own council could easily learn from.
Questions? Annie?
Community asset transfers. I've been working on feeding into policy for the Labour manifesto for next year's local elections. And through our workshopping, we found that the community keep being left dangling with even if they get to know that they could do a thing like a community assets transfer, they always get gazumped. Somehow they always get done over. And then I heard one of our esteemed local politicians actually blame the local community because they didn't get their act together quickly enough. So did the panel think that there could be some kind of support organised for communities? Because like you say, it takes so long to get things done. They haven't got money, but it is their place. How do communities get the support they need in order to get in place the legislation that's actually already there for them?
So how do we support communities? How do we support communities to do it for themselves rather than us going in, doing it for them? Go for it. We've got it.
I think that right at the heart of government, whether it's within Bristol or in central government, we need ambassadors who really, care for this cause. And at the moment, we don't have that. We need more people that know where we need to aim towards and move in that direction. And until that happens, I don't know how we're going to jump all the hoops, because if you're not in the system, it's really hard from the outside to make these things happen. And especially, I've noticed it having worked on community projects before sort of 2007, 2008, and then sort of after that, when all the cuts came in and all the really, the people who are ambassadors within Bristol City Council, all their jobs got cut. And that was the point at which it was impossible to get anything moving at a community level, because people who had jobs in the public sector had to do the one task they needed to, like deliver the arena, and they were not willing to look at anything else in the spectrum of a community-based asset because they didn't have the time frame or they couldn't take the risk. So we need to get those people back in central government to make those things happen. It's very similar to back in the 50s and 60s. Some of the most amazing public architecture was built then because there were architects in the system who were making it happen. The whole of the South Bank wouldn't have happened. Royal Festival Hall, all of those things wouldn't have happened if there were not people within the council to do that.
I have a sort of quick question off the back of that question. I think one of the things that I've sort of observed from this whole kind of process as well, and even just kind of talking to people about this conference, is that the message is quite difficult to communicate to kind of the everyday Joe. Like, why should I care? You know, I go to work, I go home, I watch Strictly. Why do I care about this? Why is this important? You know, there's a lot of other things going on, you know, politically. Let's not talk about the dirty, dirty B word. But, you know, why should people care about this? And how can we make the message a bit simpler to get people on board?
Yeah, I mean, so when I was carrying out my research for gentrification, I wouldn't call it gentrification because it's obscure to the, you know, to a lot of people anyway. Provocative, so you just speak about affordable housing because that's the fundamental problem as far as I can see it. And you know, I speak to people in pubs on Eastern Stapleton Road, still in the top 10% most deprived of roads in Bristol, by the way, despite the up and coming status of the area. And they would talk about, you can't beat the system, man. You can't beat the system. You know, this idea. So. I think what you were saying earlier, Gavin, about representation is really key. If you see somebody that you can relate to in a position of power, not only will you feel more interested, but the people in that position, in those positions, will have more empathy necessarily. So representation, I think, is key.
And maybe they'll help to cut through the jargon as well, maybe.
But it's difficult though, isn't it? Because people from more disadvantaged areas are less likely to get into these positions of being.
Shanks, do you have any quick thoughts on that?
What I'd say is I think that the system is incredibly messed up. I think the global system is, and I think one of the only ways we're going to be able to do anything, and people, you know, say, well, there's nothing we can do, and especially young people who won't be able to afford to probably even rent in Bristol very soon. Every penny that you spend it locally. So, you know, really take action on this yourself. Like, even if you're working for a larger organisation, tell them to divest. Where are their finances going? Where are their pensions going? All of those things make a difference. Every penny and where it goes now makes a difference. So if you're going to spend your money, make sure it's local. Make sure it's a local independent company, a local market, whatever it is, because every pound you spend goes £2 goes back into the local economy. So the more we can do that, the more likely we are to make a difference.
This was a controversial point that I found in my research, is that I was speaking to, I met with Kerry McCarthy at her office, MP for East Bristol, I said it earlier, and we spoke about this, and we were talking about the Tesco riots of 2011. 93% of the area signed a petition, if you don't know, to say no to Tesco, in a similar vein to what you're saying now. But Kerry, I thought, brought up an interesting point, which was that, and it was sort of spoken about earlier, was that there's some people in the local estate who prefer, even though 33% of every pound that you spend in Tesco is reinvested as opposed to abroad and thus forth, it's what those local people can afford.
It's affordability. So there's a kind of the kind of local, I suppose, independence that, you know, I've got a Greggs and a coffee shop, and the Greggs coffee's like £2 with a bacon roll, and the coffee shop's £3.80 for a coffee and a croissant, which, you know, if I've not got a very big budget, which one am I going to go to? Do you know what I mean? I could get 10 donuts for £1. You know, I've got 5 kids. Which one am I going to pick? So I guess that's the kind of rub, isn't it? That, and if we're talking about migration into communities, then, and people feeling displaced, then it's generally the people that haven't got the money that feel like they're the ones that are.
But this is where the cultural clash happens, see, because then those locals start affecting the independents who've popped up, who are the so-called gentry. There's a place called Whole Foods in Easton that's opened, and people go in there and they say, "You're ruining this area. We hate you." Whoa. They don't hate them.
Oh,
Bakery
John.
Wars.
But they think they hate
show
them,
there.
right? But, you know, these people are just being entrepreneurial and are catering to a new demographic in the area.
Martin, I just wanted to bring in, because I know you had a question. I wonder if you have any thoughts or reflections on the panel.
Well, I just wanted to share something. Okay. Thank you. I mean, this is exactly the big question in Berlin, like how to regenerate or generate without displacement. That's the bigger issue, and of course I should have maybe mentioned it more clearly, and it's about how much does the ground cost and who owns it. And I just wanted to say, yes, we have certain mechanisms. I don't say they're great, but there's this thing, it's called cooperative land development, and that means that a private developer needs to provide 30% of affordable housing, €6.50 per square meter. Many people can't afford that. However, you asked about this, what is actually affordable housing? And that is good to a certain extent, exists since 2014. However, the middle class, the lower middle class, cannot afford then the rest of the housing that is built. So it's also not really an answer to the questions that arise there. However, the big thing at the moment, which is steering up the minds in Berlin and also a bit more in Germany, is they're discussing to introduce, they call it rent lit or something, like to cut of the rents that they cannot be raised within the next 5 years. And the left party, they want to also make it possible that the rents can be lowered. And that's a very difficult, I mean, that's something which I think is great to think about these things, because many times people would say, no, this socialism cannot be possible. Yes, people now talk about it because Germany, like many other countries, have this gentrification problem, and but it needs to be done legally viable, so that we don't have then the big problem. Like, yes, we say that as a policy, but then we have all these firms that make sure, okay, no, actually it wasn't viable. So that's the big question there. So, but it's the big discussion now, and I think it's going to come, and that's one of the possibilities what to do. And I just had one idea to this question about organizational models, because I was just thinking of publicly owned, more or less owned spaces, but of course there are also pension funds. You talked about enlightened money, I like that word, and there is, for example, 2 or 3 Swiss pension funds right now in Berlin which are funding sustainable non-for-profit projects and invest or divest, whatever, pretty big amounts of money in order to make affordable spaces possible. So a connection to those guys is interesting. Maybe they're something like that similar around here, a national bank, whatever. Thank you.
The Bristol Pound, which is only, which is again a really beautiful idea. Just to say the rent cap is really interesting. The housing charity Shelter have come out in support of a rent cap of sorts, not a. They don't call it actually a rent cap. They call it something like a really sexy name, which is definitely going to appeal to the proletariat, like a rent stabilizing mechanism, backflip 360. But their proposal is, instead of a sort of a rent cap, which is arbitrary, a rent cap which is in line with inflation, because one of the unfortunate consequences, unforeseen circumstances that could result otherwise would be landlords not being able to pay off their mortgage and therefore having to move back into the property and kick the tenants out. So
I'm being given a little windy thing. So is it like 10 minutes wind up, 2 minutes wind up, 1 minute wind up? 2 minutes wind up. All right. Quick fire questions like artists, gentrification, are they victims or perpetrators? Losa.
Victims or perpetrators? Well, I think it always comes down to who is it for me.
Who's it for?
Yeah, who is it for in terms of regeneration or gentrification? And it depends what question you're trying to ask.
That's it. That's the only question. Shanks, what are we going to do? One thing we're going to do tomorrow when we go home. Spend local.
Spend local. And we're all artists and we're all victims.
Oh, that's nice. I like that. I'd like to think I'm like the master of my own destiny, or the universe. I haven't decided which one yet. Cara, any final Jerry Springer style thoughts for the room?
Take courage to say no.
Yeah, be brave. Come on.
Things that don't align with your values, put your foot down.
Yeah, I like that. Gavin, have you got any thoughts?
Engage with local developers, hopefully, rather than PLC developers, and start talking about homes and houses, units.
Nice.
Because a lot of people use the term units, and we want to try and get away from that. These are homes for people to live in, I think. Yeah.
Cool. Anyone else got anything they want to finish on before I stop? Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you very much, panel.